Hello, it's so wonderful to be here. I actually asked if I could be a part of this event. I was traveling, I have another event that I'm doing in Mumbai, and when I called Shalab and Doc, they said, come on and be a part of this fantastic event. So I am so delighted to be here. And I also know what wonderful hands you are in to have leaders like Shalab and Doc, and of course Kanan, who are shepherding this experience and really looking after volunteering in the country. It is so important to have their leadership, and I just really appreciate both of you for everything that you've done to raise the standard of volunteering. Okay, I work for IAVE. I will be very brief, because what I'm going to talk about are global trends in volunteering. IAVE has been around for more than 55 years, and we have two separate networks of global companies who are really interested in volunteering and take it as a way to deliver their corporate social responsibility. And we also have a network of civil society leaders, over 120 organizations like I Volunteer, like Boomi, around the world that are building those volunteer structures. So we are going to go on a little bit of a tour here without leaving the room, and we're going to understand what's happening to volunteering around the world. IAVE does a significant amount of research. We published a large corporate volunteering research. We have published a number of pieces of research from civil society, youth volunteering, volunteering in crisis, etc. And what I did was take these pieces of research, as well as pieces of research from United Nations volunteers and others, and took a look at, all right, well, what are all of them saying about volunteering? What are they saying about what's happening now globally, and what both volunteers and volunteering organizations are having front and center of their work? So we're going to go on that tour, and it all starts with the first one. So what these studies found, next slide please, yeah. What these studies found is that we are defining who is a volunteer very, very differently. Things like COVID, things like the climate crisis, the recognition around global inequality have really taught us to look very carefully about the definition of volunteering and to define that differently. So first and foremost, activists, people who stand in lines, people who have posters, people who to urge their governments to change, are becoming part of what we call the typography of volunteering. In the corporate world, we're seeing companies, for example, an example of this is a company in the Philippines that is actually lobbying its government to get volunteering around financial literacy and the concept of financial literacy within the national curriculum. These are efforts around using your voice and your hands. And it's something that people, particularly younger generations, are really wanting to do. They're not just interested in sort of showing up Monday or Wednesday, but they want to really understand how they can make change. I'll get to that one in a second. But that's also prompted what we like to call DIY, do-it-yourself volunteering, where it is sometimes episodic, it is micro, but it's not that I'm going to check into my volunteer slot every Monday. It looks at a much more flexible and reflexive definition of volunteering. People want to make change, and they want to do what's necessary in that moment to make change. It's also what we're calling the big tent, particularly for corporates. It isn't just about employees. It's about retirees, or Dell, in the case of Dell, who invite their consumers and their supply chain members to be a part of it. It's really about this notion of having anyone connected with our organization or anyone connected with our community or our company be part of our volunteer structure. And then this last one to point to, this notion of informal volunteers. As I like to say, most of us could not get through our day or certainly our week without the help of volunteers, but we don't tend to think of those people who are part of that informal structure of volunteering. What the COVID-19 crisis really taught us is that notion of the fabric of volunteering that exists in communities that often goes unrecognized. That really is rising up as a formal definition, getting all of the people who are really in that informal sector really thinking about them as we're planning our volunteer strategies. Okay, next slide, please. The next global trend that we found is really around this notion of equity and inclusion. And I think both inclusion and equity are witnessing, again, a global reckoning of structures that have excluded and prevented certain people for certain reasons from accessing the richness of our communities. Well, that's true with volunteering as well, particularly during the COVID crisis globally. There was suddenly this spotlight shown on people who could and couldn't volunteer, and this notion of people being excluded, either because they're shift workers, or because they have vulnerable health, or because they have mobility issues. But also something else, this notion of an unequal value we place on volunteers. And why is it that we place lesser value from someone who maybe shows up to drive someone somewhere versus a skills-based volunteer that's doing technology transfer, or this notion that all types of volunteering have different weights? Well, the past 5 years have really caused us to look at that and reckon with that, and really move away from this idea that some people are volunteers and some people are not. I sometimes think of Iberdrola, a Spanish company that has a program with the homeless community, and they match employees with homeless to do ecological projects. Their volunteering program rests within their diversity, equity, and inclusion, so it was really important to them that equity that was reflected, a value of their company, was reflected all the way down to the way they do their volunteering programs. So this has become, again, a significant global trend. All right, next one. This global trend, this is the one I think I like the best, because it really puts volunteering a little it tips it upside down a bit. So one of the things we found when we looked at some studies is there's this notion of civic duty that has always been fundamental to volunteering globally. We volunteer the way we vote or participate in our government elections, or the way we pay our taxes, et cetera. It's just something that's part of being a citizen of a country. But I think young people are redefining that and moving from what we call civic duty volunteering to civic dissent volunteering. They're volunteering because they don't want to have to solve the problem. They don't want to have to be there doing that work over and over again. They want to see the problems resolved. They want to know that the work they are doing, the volunteer work they are doing, is actually moving a needle, solving a problem. This is really, really important because it isn't something we often associate with volunteering. And one of the things I like to tell people is to really be vocal about systems change. When people paint classrooms or paint walls, they don't do it because they dislike the color of the classroom, the paint. They do it because they care about their child's education. And I tell people, make sure you connect the volunteer work you're doing with the systems change that it's actually helping to accomplish. So particularly for in this case, I think another company and corporate and NGO combination that has really been effective is a company called Linkletters, which is a global law firm, which partnered with its NGO volunteers, its corporate volunteering and its NGO partners to really look at status of asylum seekers brought on by climate, and really making sure that climate change was listed as a reason for asylum in countries. That's the type of volunteering that is not only helping, but also really bringing about a recognition that climate change is more than just a problem people are trying to solve. It is a systemic issue that we all need to pay attention to. Certainly, companies, they're really being asked not only to for their volunteer programs to be convenient, to be fun, et cetera, but they're also increasingly asked to make sure they're connected to their ESG. In other words, we want to see that the work we're doing as a corporate volunteer is connected to making the world a better place and using what we have as a company to make that happen. Okay. Can I just go back for a second? I think a good way that I like to summarize this is this last slide here. I've been in the environmental field for most of my career, and I think when I started, we would talk about things like adaptation and mitigation in terms of climate. In other words, fixing the climate, reducing our emissions, et cetera. But today, and this is largely driven by younger generation, but certainly all of us, the debate is switched more to climate equity and this emphasis on who's being left behind when we talk about solutions to climate change. That's that kind of change that I think this really represents. It's about solving problems and doing so with greater equity. Thank you. All right, next slide. This is a no-brainer, as they say. Technology is an enabler of volunteering. It's certainly viewed as more accessible. It's and certainly accessible to more people, right? You don't have to leave your room. You don't have to leave your office, et cetera. But of course, it comes what's called a digital divide. Not everyone has access or consistent access. It's difficult to initiate virtual programs, and I think for companies who often use volunteering as a team-building exercise, that's a little flat if you're all staring in front of your monitors and not really doing that connecting and that face-to-face work of volunteering. And also for companies, recognition is a really important part of volunteering, and that's, again, harder to do when you're doing it in an isolated fashion. And of course, I think we all know a little bit about Zoom fatigue and endless hours spent in front of a computer. Next slide, please. So I think the leadership pointer here is really thinking of it as adaptation, but also that what we call blended approach, that there should be virtual components, but nothing is ever going to take the place of people working side by side, shoulder to shoulder, as I like to say, on problems. So thinking about that vital component of technology, but it's certainly, there are some things that are not going to be conducive to online volunteering. Okay, next slide. Global trends, networks. I love this one because this speaks to, I think, a basic component of our humanity, that we all like to be connected and we like to know that what we're doing it in solidarity with others. I think this work is very difficult work because we are working to change systems, whether we call it that or not. We're working to solve problems. And sometimes that can be very isolating work. So one of the global trends that our research uncovered, again, over corporate and non-charity or civil society volunteering, is this notion of building networks, reaching across lines, whether it's partnerships with government, partnerships with corporations, partnership with other institutions, to accomplish your volunteering goals. And to do that with a spirit of true parity. Oftentimes, nonprofit organizations or NGOs do it with corporations, and they almost feel like service providers. And our advice is no, that you bring just as much richness as the corporate does in terms of its talent or scope or funding. So this notion that we're really all working together it's a learning and knowledge exchange, and speaking with a global voice. When you have one person or one organization doing something, that's powerful. But when you have 120 countries represented, when you have 300 leaders from all over the world saying the same thing about the importance of volunteering, well, now then that becomes culture change, and that becomes a momentum and a movement. And then, again, this notion of really supporting one another in our work and making sure we're connected both, again, within our sector or within our organizational structure and then beyond. Next slide. All right. Global trend. I keep saying these are all my favorite, but this one really is my favorite, I think. This is this notion of volunteering from we to me. So when we talk about volunteering, we always talk in terms of the beneficiary. We always say we had 1,000 meals served, or we tutored 150 children or something. But why don't we ever talk about the benefit of the volunteer and to the volunteer? Because that is so powerful. I think we're all experiencing a global reduction in the amount of volunteers, people that are showing up to volunteer. I think COVID started that, but that phenomenon is lingering. In my country, the U.S. Peace Corps, which had for many years been the standard bearer, is now struggling to find people who will become volunteers. And I think that's because we've, for far too long, spoken about it as if the benefit is all elsewhere. But what we have found consistently, and what you all know to be the truth, is that the volunteer benefits just as much, if not more, than the beneficiary. If that hasn't occurred to you, or you've never seen that, which I highly doubt, each and every one of you in this room are volunteers. You know the power of working to solve problems and how that can make you feel more empowered. There are tons of studies on the benefits, the positive benefits of volunteering. We did some of our own in terms of youth work. When youth volunteer, their mental health, their well-being increases dramatically. They feel that they are empowered to act, and that gives them a position of power in their own communities. They feel like it's a chance to join with others and to share problems and to develop these support systems. They also find pathways to employability. There is no question that when you volunteer, you become more valuable in both in your company, or if you're a student thinking of entering the workforce. The generation, the Gen Zs are redefining this, right? They're no longer thinking about university, right? And employers are increasingly not asking what uni did you attend, but they're asking you questions about what's your critical thinking? How do you solve problems? How do you get along with people? How do you build coalition? Those are all things that are derived from volunteering, and yet we never talk about it. So I say, let's flip that whole thing on its head. And what would you do in your own volunteering programs if you started with the premise that this is all for the volunteer? How would you look at that program differently? What metrics would you put around it? And how would you sell it? Because when you do that, I think the whole idea of getting people more engaged as volunteering because of what's in it for them is something we have always shied away from. And yet, that is the most powerful factor, because again, no one in this room, or everyone in this room, understands the power of being a volunteer, the richness, the energy, the life support, and the friendships that are made. So I say let's talk about that. And let's put that front and center. Don't be afraid to talk about the systems change. Don't be afraid to center the program as if it were on the volunteer as the central beneficiary. Okay, next slide, please. All right, just some things in terms of the future. with that, there's an expression that we often use, and it's, think outside the box, right? Of course, that means be creative. But I always like to say, think inside the box too, because culture is enormously important, whether it's your own national culture or your company culture. It has to be modeled within your volunteer programs, right? It has, because that's what really makes people identify and start to really connect. So think outside the box, absolutely, be creative, etc. But also remember at the end of the day that your culture and how you do things will also need to resonate to get more volunteers more consistently. All right, yes, again, meeting true needs of beneficiaries, but really make sure you're talking about the systems change that is always behind your actions. We are doing this to solve this problem. This is the role you are playing in solving a global crisis. And don't be afraid to do that and to continue to provide that feedback and to make those connections. People ask me all the time about measuring impact. As they say, that's as long as a ball of string, right? How long is a ball of string? It depends on the ball of string. There are so many ways to do it. Start with what makes sense and keep doing it. Even if it's narrative. People shy away, as somebody who needs to ask for funding from grants, they always want to see numbers, and I always want to challenge that and tell them stories are powerful as well, right? We all know that the stories, and we have lots of those narrative stories of how volunteering is changing lives. And remember, always stay connected to those networks. This is an excellent network. There are also lots of other global networks. Kanan talked about Good Deeds Day. Of course, IAVE has its networks as well, and making sure you're participating in those. Okay, I think that might be my last slide. Thank you. That's my last slide. Thank you so much.